Okay. I see a few more people have joined now, so good time to start. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming today. Today we are talking about urban design. And I think the reason for today's session is really because a few months ago, earlier this year, we had a session where the urban planning students from UCT presented their theses from last year, and then people could just ask them questions about their work and also what was the course like and how did they find the whole process of looking for work. So, and it was quite a good discussion. So I think for today, we actually just want to do something similar, but more focusing on urban design. So we obviously have, kind of two streams in which we can talk. The one is actually about Kevin and Nicola and Phillippa's content of their work, which I'm really excited to hear about. But then also just in terms of what was it like to prepare the thesis and how much time did you take and what was your struggles and also what was the course like and where are you working at the moment? So all these kinds of questions people are free to ask today. And how I think it will work, we'll give each speaker a chance, 15 minutes or so, to talk about their work, their project. And then straight afterwards, I think we can have some minutes to talk directly about the content. But then I think at the end, we should leave space to talk about more, bigger topics like the course and what you guys are doing now and things like that. So yeah, I think without further ado, we can start. I'll introduce each speaker as we go, but I think we'll start with Kevin and then we'll go to Phillippa and then Nicola. So Kevin, you look like you're in the jungle, but you are a tropical island or something. Makes me very jealous, but you are actually in Cape Town at the moment, right? And you're working for Hedley, and you finished studying urban design at UCT 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think people could see your bio in the event detail. I think you can just start introducing us and taking us through your topic.
Thanks. Let me get the timer going. So I'll just share my screen now. Now get it going.
Cool, you can see it.
Great. Hey everyone, it's nice to be here and I'm very excited to present my thesis to you. It was a long journey with a lot of confusion but a lot of passion in trying to understand the African migrant experience in Cape Town. And sorry, I'll just go back. So the topic of my thesis was the interface and the search for legibility of urban form for African migrants in Cape Town, South Africa. And the topic began from a fascination where I asked my friends that I was staying with who came from different African countries, just trying to understand how they navigate Cape Town. And it soon dawned on me that the navigation of Cape Town was quite limited. So it was either school, church, town, like the routes were quite limited. And I found that quite fascinating. And I also happened to ask some of my friends who also came from Europe, just trying to understand how they also navigated Cape Town. And I noticed that their navigation of Cape Town was more like there was much more navigation of Cape Town compared to some of my friends from other African countries. And I wanted to ask the question, is there something about Cape Town's urban structure that either enables navigation for African migrants or prevents that navigation? So that led me to the study. But then I had to look at a bigger picture, trying to understand the African migrant experience in African cities in trying to migrate. And obviously there's all these stories we hear from the Cape to Melia, where people try to migrate across Africa and out of Africa to look for opportunities. And often we find this is the scenario that people face, lots of barriers, lots of borders, lots of boundaries that prevent people from migrating. And in Cape Town particularly, there's a lot of xenophobic attitudes to understanding the foreigner. And that's a concept that I struggle with, understanding how you can be foreign in the same continent. And there's lots of stories at around the time that I was developing the thesis where there'd been a lot of refugee protests and people wanting to move out of South Africa because of the treatment that they faced in the country. That led me to trying to pose the migrant problematique, understanding how migrants move within South Africa, out of Africa and beyond, and trying to understand how people can think globally and think locally and act globally. And then in trying to understand who we phrase as the migrant, it made me understand a more personable approach, because a migrant is your friend, a student, a refugee, a cab driver, and often the person that we think of as the other. And I was, in part of understanding the interface, I'm always interested and fascinated around this idea of aspiration, where aspiration meets precarity, where people often would sell on the street, but then eventually would be able to afford to own an entire building block for business opportunities. And in trying to understand the migrant movement within Cape Town, it dawned on me that migrants coming from outside of South Africa contributed quite largely to people moving into the Western Cape. And obviously that reflects quite interestingly in looking at employment and residential patterns, where people live very far from the places of opportunity. However, this was a different case that I noticed when I studied migrant patterns. So in trying to put all these ideas together, I think I was led by two main things. One is understanding the legibility of urban form, and also trying to understand migrant urbanism practices. And I think where those meet, I think, is the production of space. I think with both. One, in trying to contextualize what legibility means in the African context, and also understanding how migrant urbanism practices actually lead to the creation of space. And also understanding how spaces can be created through appropriation, through occupation, understanding that spaces are always in a state of flux. There's also chances to celebrate diversity, and also understanding what we mean by invented or invited spaces. So trying to understand a migrant or ethnic enclave in Nairobi, with a high Somali population compared to a similar demography in Belleville CBD, and trying to understand if there's particular everyday landmarks that people latch onto in the creation of space. My area was specifically looking at how African migrants move in Cape Town, and I was looking at three main things: there's movement, settlement, and opportunities or occupation. And so trying to understand which are the preferred areas of settlements for migrants. And it soon I found it interesting that most of the spaces were either along the Vutrek corridor or the Southern corridor, areas that had multimodal access to circulation, areas that had mixed income and mixed racial groups, to be able to facilitate sort of a shadowing effect where people could live in between both without standing out too much. And also being close to areas of opportunity that would be main CBDs, I think, was quite important as an area of settlement. Also, in terms of the interviews that I undertook, in understanding local African migrants who came from outside of Cape Town, there's also preferred areas to live. And what was more interesting was the navigation towards the CBD that was a space that allowed for more diversity and opportunities. And then I tried to map out a few ethnic enclaves, one in the Long Street Green Market Square area. There was also the Beach Road parking that often serves as a taxi rank, the Belleville station, and the Mowbray area. And it was so fascinating seeing the program of activities that take place in some of these enclaves. The urban interface was very rich and very diverse, and it featured a lot of activities that took place on the eye level. What I also found very fascinating was trying to understand ethnic enclaves, trying to understand if there's particular everyday landmarks that create conditions for ethnic enclaves to develop. And there was very interesting aspects like internet cafes, ethnic restaurants, cellular shops, barber shops and salons, clothing stores. There's a couple of things, if you look into the matrix, that started to suggest that there's a couple of conditions that have to come together for ethnic enclaves to result. And then the site I was looking at was flanked by the Portswood Road, Granger Bay Boulevard, Beach Road, and Helen Suzman Boulevard. That's the Somerset Hospital precinct. And I chose that area because I found it fascinating that it was one of the areas where a lot of occupations were taking place in the city of Cape Town. And appropriation through occupation for me was very interesting because it started to talk about a different creation of space in the city of Cape Town in a way that wasn't envisioned before. And if you look at the map, it starts showing that there's a gap where all these everyday landmarks that were analyzed as probable conditions that come together were lacking in that area. And I tried to think, well, how can that area be adapted to be able to foster more migrant urbanism? And so I got into this journey trying to understand how to reimagine the post-colonial African city through migrant urbanism and what that looks like. And trying to understand migrant production of space through Susan Hall's loose infrastructure, where people produce space through the smallest of objects, like a table. And then it also got me to understanding the historic timeline of the production of space in Cape Town through migrant urbanism and how people came into Cape Town, and that area specifically being a site where there was a lot of there was a prison that held a lot of prisoners that came from overseas. So this space has constantly been a space that has allowed for difference and diversity, and even now being a space that continues to be used by different racial and ethnic and religious groups. And so I'm fascinated by the interface between physical landmarks, that's an existing building, and socially constructed landmarks, which result from social connections and social interaction. So I was trying to understand that how can you enhance the interface to be able to allow for migrant urbanism practices to celebrate diversity? And so I start seeing a lot of production of space happening in Cape Town, being from the occupations and the household dwellings that happen at the backyards. And I also see the contextualization of how people develop space. And a lot of times it's informed by culture and power. So the people who have power determine how the urban form looks like. And in this green market square, it's interesting to understand the level of power that the business owners have in this area and what level they're able to influence the space. So I look into a couple of performance criteria that lead to the creation of urban space. And in terms of enhancing space, issues to do with continuity and diversity, making spaces more accessible, enhancing legibility, increasing transparency, imbuing names and meanings to space, allowing for flags, enabling identity, and celebrating variety are some of the areas that I thought would be interesting to highlight through this space. So this got me to understanding how the arrival, how do African migrants enter into the city, and trying to pick out various landmarks that could contribute to legibility. And I contrasted that with the case in Nairobi, Kenya, where I noticed a lot of trade activities became a continuous line of legibility, where people are able to move through space. And then in trying to understand the movement in Cape Town, I tried to map out the different lines and channels and gateways where people would get into Cape Town CBD, specifically migrants. And then I got into understanding settlement patterns. How do people settle in Cape Town? Where are the preferred areas of settlement, and what are the different typologies that people prefer? And then also understanding different housing opportunities between short stay, in terms of hotels, adaptive spaces, and mixed-use spaces. And then in terms of understanding the livelihoods, it was interesting to map out all the different schools, religious centers, public facilities across that area, and trying to see if there was a tentative connection that allowed for legibility for people to move freely around those spaces. And then in terms of understanding an adaptive framework, it was interesting to map out what you see as the red buildings, trying to pose that, could we adapt hotels in the Cape Town CBD to allow for short stays for migrants entering into the city? And then in terms of looking at a continuous framework or something that allows for creation of space, I tried to map out the shared public space to become an anchor to ground the entire precinct. And that would be able to follow the different trajectories that we've talked about in terms of allowing for flags and allowing for invented and invited spaces, and trying to link that at a sub-metro scale. Similarly, in the image on the left, you can see there's the areas shaded in blue that starts to speak about what we can consider shared public space, private space, and space, and also understanding clear movement routes and enhanced accessibility. And then there was a process of design trying to define what the public space is, taking into account that there's existing buildings that would serve as special places, but also retrofit them in a way that works for the context. So trying to imagine that the corner of the Somerset Hospital could serve as a taxi rank, which it already serves at the moment. And then, but I was very interested looking at the special buildings and trying to create adaptive spaces. And there's a couple of programs that resulted trying to rethink the Helen Bowden nursing home that's currently occupied by Reclaim the City and is now the Ahmed Katrada House. Trying to understand how that could be an adaptive short stay accommodation option for people moving into the city. Trying to also look at retrofitting the Somerset Hospital building to serve a more mixed-use function, and also looking at the open spaces around it, serving a more adaptive space and being more exhibition spaces for trade and for different kind of time-based zoning activities. And this is the entire precinct, trying to understand the different types of space between shared, public, and private space, and seeing how that can be a continuous movement, taking people from the Helen Suzman Boulevard all the way to the waterfront that would then be retrofitted to be more accessible to the public. And this is just another render, just trying to understand how the build form would look like in terms of massing and the interface. And in trying to understand migrant patterns over time, I think it's important to look at the timeline. So there was an understanding of trying to map out how first generation migrants would navigate space and what would be the important conditions to put in place. And those would be more short-term accommodation, clear routes to the CBD and also to the site. The second generation would be more interested in securing or finding public facilities, accessing public facilities like schools in the area, around the area, religious facilities, and trying to create a broader framework that's clear and allows for greater legibility. And the third generation migrants, I think, we would be trying to understand how to create a sense of home, a sense of passing on legacy and culture. And that would be more long-term, trying to expand outwardly out of the site and trying to find areas of opportunity that can be retrofitted to be able to host some of the everyday landmarks that I'd been talking about earlier to create a sense of belonging. So I go back to my fascination, trying to understand that interface between aspiration and precarity. How can we make the best use of understanding African urban migrant practices in trying to lead to a creation of space that celebrates diversity and also allows for integration of different social groups while still allowing for legibility in a different context. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Wow, it's such an interesting topic and such a good example of how urban design is not just something physical, right? It's this like interface between relationships and how people interact with space. And yeah, it's a really, really nice example of that. I have some questions, but maybe if there's anyone on the floor who has a question for Kevin about his project, about the content, about the process.
Not yet, but maybe like at the end, just need to let it sink in.
Okay, no, I agree. I was just wondering if you did any interviews or anything like that.
Yeah, so I started off doing interviews with a select group of African migrants that had come from outside of Cape Town and outside of South Africa. But the pool was quite small. It was mostly students who had come from different African countries. But then when I started mapping the information, I gave me a preset list, like it was very predictable after I did the entire mapping. So I started doing more interviews with some of the people from the site, interviewing nurses who worked at the Somerset Hospital, just trying to understand how the building has changed over time and what their sense of the area has been since the occupation started happening and that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I think that must have been quite valuable information. And something that I think in practice, I wish we could do more, but Usually there isn't
Yeah.
really scope for that kind of, yeah.
I agree. There was a lot of desktop research as well, because it was trying to merge what's currently happening and what are the global trends in migrant urbanism from different contexts, and how that would inform how people see everyday landmarks.
Shanique, do you have a question?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much for that presentation. It was super insightful, and yeah, I feel like I learned a lot just about more of a spatial look at Cape Town, and I actually did my thesis in a similar topic on the policy side of spatial planning, but in Cape Town as well. And I wanted to know what, in your opinion, is some of the barriers and the factors that act as restrictions for migrants to come into the city. Was that something you looked at?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Thanks, Shanique. I think there was a section that I talked about barriers, boundaries, and borders. And I think it ranges. It ranges because I think there's issues. The way I phrased the thesis, I think there was 3 issues of movement, settlement, and opportunities. So in terms of movement, there's definitely a lot of infrastructure, I think, that led to a lot of illegible infrastructure that led to a lot of boundaries. So if you look at the Helen Suzman Boulevard, part of it is not pedestrianized, which then discourages a lot of pedestrian movement. And as well, in trying to walk around the area, there was definitely, I tried to map out some unclear and illegible parts that were either incomplete or weren't really legible in terms of markers and landmarks. So just from an urban form perspective, the area was not quite legible. And then in terms of settlement, mapping, in terms of mapping settlements, from a racial perspective, when you overlay the racial demography of Cape Town, you then start to see very homogeneous sections that discourage a lot of mixing or mixed income, mixed group residential typologies. And then in terms of opportunities, I think that's where there was a little bit of hope, because you could start seeing public facilities spread around the areas, being areas where they could encourage some integration. So religious buildings, businesses, taxi rank, not so much, but cell phone shops. There's a couple of everyday landmarks that if you map across that area, you start seeing being places of interaction and places that can encourage or can reduce barriers.
Thank you.
Thanks. So once you get past the barrier, then it becomes more welcoming in a way. Interesting. Jody?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. That's brilliant work. When I was at Cape Town Partnership in sort of 2012 to 2014, we did a little bit of work on this. There was at that time a lot of pressure from certain sort of big business and landowner interest groups to clean up the city, and it's veiled xenophobia and that sort of thing. A lot of it focused on getting a different trader model for Green Market Square, and getting rid of some of the sort of, for want of a better word, sort of spaza shops in around town, the shops that sell just like chips and cookies, and then maybe also have a printer at the back that you can do some printing, and maybe there's like a tailor also in the corner and that sort of thing. So we did some research to sort of show that those businesses actually had very high turnover per rand turnover per square meter, and had very high jobs per square meter. So actually, from an economic perspective, contributed quite a lot in comparison to like a gallery or whatever that might replace it. And in that, some of the researchers went off on, quite a journey of research, and did a small art project of mapping where everybody had come, and we did a mural of where everybody had come to on Harrington Street and things like that. But it was such a light touch, and it almost feels like you've gone deeper and kind of completed the journey of that work. So thank you for that. It feels almost quite sentimental to me. I lived on Hart Street for 4 years, and there's a lot of migrants obviously working and living around that area, and the images of the occupation of the migrants protesting to be extradited was right outside the building where I lived for months. So all of that is sort of very close to home for me. So it's such a wonderful sort of pleasure to see that somebody had done this work. It's such a hopeful vision for the CBD that you present. And right now there's so many conversations around what does recovery of the CBD look like post-pandemic, and all of that sort of thing. And I just sort of wonder, what audiences have you presented this to, and have you presented this to any potential decision makers and that sort of thing. I think it would be wonderful to get exposure for it if you haven't already.
Thanks, Jody. These are really sentimental views. I haven't presented it outside of the institution, but I think that's a really good opportunity to start. I mean, you speak about the issue with a lot of passion and a lot of sentiment. So I think it's good to know that other people feel as strongly about this topic. And I think definitely I look into other avenues to present this work, I think, because I think that was one of the main motivations for me to pick up this work, because I think that the migrant voice was lost in trying to understand how urban spaces are created, and migrants contribute a lot into creating of space, but often not recognized. So thanks for highlighting that. I think I'll definitely see how to take it further.
Yeah, I think it's such a general problem with the amazing work that students do in general, and then it actually has so much more potential to have an impact, as I'm sure Katie knows. But maybe, Kevin, we can explore a follow-up, online event where you present your work to stakeholders, and you're welcome to use the Young Urbanist platform for that. I see we have a question about your work being available on the UCT platform. If someone wants to share it or read it.
I'll need to confirm, and then can I get back to you, Janine, on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can always share the link later. So.
Okay, great.
Okay. I think this is a topic that we can really discuss for a long time, but we need to move on now. So, Phillippa, I think I'm going to hand over to you. So, Phillippa and I studied together almost 10 years ago, dare I say it. Phillippa was busy doing her landscape architecture course while I was doing planning. And since then, Phillippa studied urban design. So that's why she's here tonight. And Phillippa, you are now working at the city, correct?
I am working for the planning and development and project management office. Yeah, for
so you could take Kevin's work further, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we've got our ECD component, which they are very much more in the traders side, but that definitely is an area in which we can look at. So nice. Kevin, offline we can.
It's all about networking.
Let's do
that. Okay, cool, Phillippa. I'm going to hand over to you. Looking forward to it.
Oh, thanks so much. Please do also shout. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my sound. Woodstock, very windy. So if suddenly I go off, please someone do shout and let me know, because this Wi-Fi and wind doesn't seem to work too well together.
At the moment, it's fine. So all good.
Oh, good. Okay, lovely. Thanks so much, Janine. Okay, so my research project title was Manenberg Negotiated, and it was looking at answering questions communities are not asking. I will just quickly do a little mapping of where we're going. So I'll quickly run through an intro of sort of where the sort of thesis topic came from, sort of the objectives and the research title, looking at my methodology a little bit, sort of action research, and the process of the product was quite key in this thesis, and then looking at how it lands specifically in Manenberg, and the principles that we use, which were central around people, power, and place, and then the sort of resultant strategy and placemaking framework. And then just sort of final thoughts on sort of the role of the designers, sort of how I ended up concluding my thesis. So this is just a overview of where sort of my ideas and sort of provocation came from within the theoretical framework. I already had a location in mind before starting, which was Manenberg. I was very interested in post-colonial discourse, as well as incremental occupancy, which Manenberg's quite notorious for gang territories, so that incrementalism is quite key, as well as how spaces are negotiated in that, as well as the role of the designer and sort of as an actor within the code designing process, also with the responsibility of transposing community needs and aspirations, as well as a responsibility to critically analyze and establish missing links to design an incremental framework and strategy for intervention. So a few of my objectives were just to spatially unpack intense territorial negotiation and spatial claims within the public realm in Manenberg, to review the prescriptive limits of the approach of engaging the informal city as sort of this problem to be solved, and as well as to develop quite key and integrated community-led upgrading method for active participation and sort of exploring co-design solutions with residents. And quite key in that is detailing the process over the product. So my research question was, how can designers intervene in a manner which creatively alters the persistent dominance of exclusion in the public realm? And in doing so, can the community be invited into the process? And this is quite special for me in the Manenberg negotiated, because the subtitle is answering questions communities are not asking. And it almost sort of becomes a bit of a commentary on how sort of previous areas of exclusion, the marginalized and the informal city, often don't have a voice in the conversation of how their spaces are conceived and designed for them, often without them contributing. So this leads to my methodology, which I used action research, which is based on the premise of a need for public engagement and participation to ensure that design development with the community informs research and influences the outcome of the proposal. The co-design in this research project required quite active engagement, where the participants explored values, issues, threats, and opportunities relating to a set of principles through a series of three process stages, which is, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but diagnosis, streaming, and design. So it was very much an iterative process. And this collaboration and co-constructing of place formed the catalyst of pursuing this process over the product. So throughout this sort of iterative design, the three principles emerged of people, power, and place. And through these design processes, they could be interrogated across multiple scales. So sort of a study area, neighborhood, and street. With the participants establishing outcomes, sort of diagnosing their spatial negotiations and sort of dreaming proposals of intervention while continuously testing them as we moved along. And then that was sort of the urban design process following patterns sort of below that as well. I realized I could go into these quite in depth, so I'm going to try and be a bit quick with this. But sort of, so I set up a timeline and planning for myself with my action research. And so in initiating this process of community-led design, there was multiple methods that I used. sort of data collection, focus groups, as I've mentioned, multiple interviews, analysis of documents, site visits, observations, workshop sessions, and interviews with local authorities and other professionals within the public participation realm. And then we dealt, well, we, being me, apparently multiple personalities, did a diagnosis stage, the dreaming stage, and design stage. And then again, just my timeline and just a quick overview of some of the focus group participants. So it was multiple members from ex-gangsters, mothers, addicts, soccer coaches, social workers, professionals, and the groups varied in size and per session, depending on availability of space and whether there was access due to gang fights. So this is a timeline of my methodology of my code design process pretty much captured. So at the bottom, we've got the timeline. And this approach sort of sought to explore and test with the stakeholder groups to diagnose the needs. So that's the diagnosis stage, to dream up the possible actions, and then to design possible interventions that we pursued together. So this overview, sort of the dreaming or the diagnosis stage was the first stage. And so there were 3 sets of focus groups and had 3 sessions per principle. So you'll see there's people, power, and place that we diagnose under that first stage, and then the same happens people, process, place under dreaming, and the same group did the same under design. So diagnosis was looking at context of the community, and the aim was to have the participants establish the needs of the community with the community as their main source of information. Dreaming stage of the focus groups, the participants identified possible key values and potential threats to these being realized. And then the final stage, being design, is where they begin to articulate sort of interventions and how these could possibly be located in particular areas. And you can see some little mapping and some model building that was done there. Okay, I think that's enough on that. So Manenberg itself, just a quick overview. So the results of apartheid spatial planning pretty much eroded the security of marginalized groups, and the ensuing spatial injustice has left, as most of us know, 2 major challenges to overcome: sprawl and segregation. And these 2 most notable characteristics are sort of the apartheid design. And the realization of this is seen in the formation of Manenberg, which is located on the Cape Flats. And most notably, Manenberg is associated with gangsterism, claims to territories, drugs, extreme poverty. And in order to comprehend the highly complex structure of these controlling territory of gangs, we also can't understand them without considering the conditions which gave rise to them, particularly because as a society, we have created some of the neighborhoods that make this gang formation almost inevitable. So this here is just a quick overview as a broader context. Manenberg has weak links to many social and economic connections to the city. The dominant road network structure runs in a north to southerly movement flow, with Jake's Herbal bounding, there we go, the community on the western edge, sort of producing an impenetrable barrier to the east-west connection. And then this spatial separation is exacerbated with the rail network, the road network, and the canal network on the eastern edge, pretty much disconnecting Manenberg from its neighbors, Gugs, Harderveld, and Phillippa. Yeah, so what was quite key in addressing or attempting to start engaging with this was establishing an approach that asked the question of, you know, what is the question that communities want answered? As designers, there's often a tendency to answer a question through our own testing of design and planning that a community actually wasn't asking in the first place. And so what was becoming a bit more apparent for me in practice is the need to respond to issues and sort of crises in underserved communities in a way in which their participation is actually required. So this leads on to sort of the 3 principles. So the focus groups were created around these 3 sets of principles, which were intended to explore the iterative design process. And they were structured around 3 scales of the study area, the neighborhood, and the street. And then the intention was to allow the question of what the community wanted to emerge from within the groups, rather than an external idea presented to the group to evaluate, which is often how governmental structures do push things onto communities. So this is a lot of information on one slide, but I just had wanted to give a little bit of a snapshot of some of the work that was done. And it's quite hard to condense a thesis into 20 slides or so. So this is an attempt, but I'll basically just focus on the diagnosis, dreaming, and designing stages and the sort of quick outcomes. I mean, there were pages on each one of these, so I'm sorry that this is the quickest snapshot I can give. But so participatory planning approach is the main thrust of this people principle, and it emphasizes involvement in the decision-making process of the community. Within this stage, we looked at sort of the negotiated open spaces, the land use mapping, and some of the sort of key outcomes of the diagnosis stage was the community varied their definition of what access is, as well as there were quite a limited range of choices within the community. Then we moved on to our dreaming stage, and this in the diagnosis stage, this is where the focus group started doing their mapping and highlighting different points of crises, of critical intervention needed, different color codes, which I won't go into right now. The dreaming stage, we then started putting it onto paper, with key outcomes being the established areas of intervention and prioritization of services that would trigger new activities. So this is a little bit snapshot of the Focus 1 group and their sort of results. And then the designing stage, which you'll see some of the mapping happening at the bottom there, and some of the model building, was looking at strategy that was very much driven by youth development and economic opportunities. And this was quite interesting, was the establishment of partnerships was very key, and seeing who was acting within the space. And then just some, sorry, I realize I'm running out of time. Janine, give me a shout if I'm taking too long. And then just some of the reflections of what was envisioned for the space. So I'll try and speed it up and do it a bit quicker. Then we dealt with power, looking more at a neighborhood scale. So key outcomes were looking at the relationship of movement and the conflicts during gang fights and safe spaces. So we did a lot of mapping of existing gang territories and how schools are in between most of the gang territories and what that means for safety. So there were, yeah, I mean, within Manenberg, there's 27 active gangs in this tiny little 1.5 kilometer stretch, which is crazy when you think of occupancy, with schools in between all of them. So then what we started looking at with the dreaming stage was how do you shift power of gangs, and there were proposals of multiple safety outposts for law enforcement to be located within the community. There was, in this designing, it was quite an interesting proposal because a few of the community members mentioned mirroring what gangs do with law enforcement. Gangs usually have lookouts on multiple corners, and they were saying the community knows where those corners are, that is where we need to intervene. And so that's where a lot of these reflections and locations come from. So, and again, some reflections, sorry, I'm taking so long. Then we drop down into the street on the third principle of place. And so again, there were lots of different mappings going on with this, but some of the key outcomes in this was, again, very definition and understanding of different distances and scales, which was quite interesting. And what we assume with a sort of a standard CSIR sort of standard of how far distances should be and walkable distances, it's actually was a lot shorter in intense territorial spaces, especially with gangs and safety. Again, streaming, so some of the outcomes was no back gardens due to density backyard dwellings, therefore streets need to be designed in a way to facilitate this better, as life already happens there, was one of the comments from one of the participants. So then again, the designing, some of the outcomes from the designing process was looking at strategy to look at streets and spaces where activity is already emerging and build on it, and using linear parks to disturb the status quo of neglected territories. And the linear parks idea came specifically from a couple of the mothers on the distance kids have to run for safety. And if the parks, because they're so sparse and dispersed within the community, if there's a lot more parks closer to home, then the kids don't have to run far to get to shelter. So the idea of linear parks was quite important for a lot of the community members. And I think I've got 3 minutes left. Not even. So then what we ended up going to, and I'll rush through this, is sort of a strategy on 3 types of safety outposts, hybrid hubs, and linear parks. And these sort of establish these equalizing networks. And what we started looking at is incremental testing, where these scenarios could start happening, where are the points and what the connections start doing. So the scenario looks at seeds that grow outwards in terms of impact. The second scenario testing was looking at sort of a cluster of these 3 strategies in one space together. And then the third one was looking at the various strategy types at multiple points, especially where there are actual existing partners already operating. Yeah, I've got 1 minute left. So, this is just some of the ideas on the strategy. So these are the safety outposts and how that connection can start happening. Again, just a quick idea on the equalizing networks and how the structure can be set up in the space. And all of these positions have been designed with the community testing back iteratively. I just ended up transposing their locations onto space, and we, yeah, that's where a lot of the co-design came from. And then here's just a quick snapshot of how this could be implemented over a multi-year sort of program and what it would be addressing at different locations. So that's at Manenberg High School, and you can see the different sites that have been identified and what actions need to take place in each one. And then just a high-level making framework. This is the final result of, I think there's probably about 6 or 7 strategy items that finally result in this strategic framework plan of these equalizing networks. But a lot of it just looks at how it's incremental investment. And so starting at, say, Manenberg Avenue and starting at Belinda Walk rather than a full master plan in one. And it is incrementalism is what the idea was behind all of this. So then just to end off, what we did with the strategy was looking at all these, so the safety outposts, the hybrid hubs and the linear parks, what are some of the partners? So what ended up and became quite apparent at the end of it was the partnerships and actually starting to identify them to make these strategies work. And so we did a hard graph of who these would be. And yeah, I think for me, one of the big outcomes from this was sort of the designer's role to spatially represent all citizens within this urban arena, and sort of achieving this through this action research or people city design approach. And this sort of incremental approach produces this kind of innovation outside of the preconceived idea of a product of design, pursuing rather the sort of process over the product was what I ended up looking at. So I think, sorry, Janine, I've taken up I think a bit more time than I should have. Sorry.
That's fine, Phillippa. I mean, it's amazing work. So I wasn't even thinking about the time. Thanks so much. This is really incredible. Again, super valuable work, similar to Kevin in terms of like the actualities of the reality of the topic that you chose. And it's super interesting to see how you've developed this very detailed methodology. And I almost wish that you could implement it so that someone can reflect on the impact of this kind of methodology versus what you were saying, just the normal way of designing and then coming in later. I'm sure people have questions and you guys are welcome to raise your hands. I was just wondering, maybe just as a first question, can you maybe stop sharing so that I can just see everyone's hands?
Yes, pause share. What's that? Pause share. No, stop share. That's what I do.
Cool. Okay, that wasn't my question, but
that's a good question. It's an easy one for me to answer. I'm happy
for an
with
instruction.
Let me see if my video can work. So I sort of.
It doesn't look like it.
Oh well.
That's fine. Oh, there. Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering just about like the preparation in terms of how you managed to get people together and how much time did you need to really build trust and build the network and get to know the community. How long did that take?
Yeah, it was a labor of love, as Katie will tell you. But because I've been so interested in it, I did know it would take a lot of my time. I also was working at the time as well, so I was still employed full time. So it had to mainly be in the evenings and on weekends. I am quite lucky that, well, not lucky. I mean, we've quite intentionally positioned ourselves in Manenberg, hence my interest. But my husband plays football for Manenberg soccer club, so it was quite easy getting a lot of soccer players to answer a lot of questions after training. But yeah, it took a lot of planning, and that's why I wanted to upfront sort of show the calendar pretty much, and going like, you've actually got to be really intentional with space, and carving out space. I mean, to do this, if you're wanting to engage in that level of depth, and if you're wanting to get the results that I did, I mean, it was invaluable. A lot of there was nothing I would have been able to think about on my own. I mean, the nuances were just unbelievable. I think you've got to also be flexible. Not a lot of data, you know, people won't necessarily show up. Gang fights obviously restricts a lot of space, so you've got to be willing to be flexible. I know a lot of students, obviously it's quite different with COVID times as well now. I mean, I missed the COVID, I was before obviously, or Corona, so I did have the luxury of being able to meet people face to face, and then obviously asking photographs, can I take your photograph? I got consent from everyone that I used, you know, which is a bit laborious, but it's important and needed. I think setting up your sort of structuring what you want to get out of it. I think I learned a hard lesson the first time. I think I thought people would just talk, which obviously isn't the case. And that's when I started getting different tools like printing large A0 maps, having lots of different colors, which I find people find very interesting to start putting pegs in places when it's a little bit more interactive, and looking at multiple tools, because some people will draw, some people won't. That's why model building, just lots of different tools to try and get the best out of it, and what you're wanting to explore. And what I was wanting to explore was, can the community actually develop what they need themselves, rather than us imposing an idea, which very easily, yes, but you've just got to sort of provide the tools.
Yeah, and take the time to prepare and build the relationships and things like that. Yeah, no, but that's incredible. It's really well done for taking it on. I really hope it can go further and become something that gets used actually.
Yeah, I think that was I must be careful because I do work for government, so I must be quite light in houses. But I think seeing the failing of how some governmental structures respond to the public engagement is why I wanted to see if we could test, or I could test it in another way. Yeah.
Kevin, you have a question?
Yeah, it's actually such a great segue into what you've just said, Phillippa. I really always enjoy your process and your methodology. I think it's a very interesting way to practice urban design and especially public participation. I think I'm interested to ask your role as the urban designer in that process. And particularly, I know we've previously mentioned that in planning standards, 100 meters would be seen as walkable. But when you started understanding how spaces are negotiated, 25 meters is still also very, very dangerous to walk alone. So just trying to understand, in your role as the urban designer, was there like reflection on changing planning standards, planning and design standards for those particular contexts?
Yeah, I think that is what I'd wanted to look at. I think one of the sort of big issue, not big issues, but within the Manenberg space, particularly, so safety, I mean, is a good example to look at, but the police station is actually located outside of Manenberg proper. So there's just no presence in one of the most, and I know for their own safety, I think they are outside of the community, but you know, in terms of safety for a community that they serve, and when I say governmental structures, I think there's a lot that goes into it, but and that's where the smaller spaces came in, with a lot of the community members saying there's really key outposts which officers can patrol, we can assist. And one of the interesting things that happened actually during this, and talking about sort of, I'll get a segue back to the standards a little bit, but during this time, that's when the military actually was brought in to address a lot of the gang activity. And what was so interesting was, I mean, we would be having our, often a lot of my workshops were sort of on the bonnet of my car on the side of the road. And we would have the big sort of military tankers going past and, you know, addressing it. And the amount of the participants who just started laughing, being like, oh my goodness, they're on the complete wrong road. Oh my goodness, they don't even know, like that, they're not even in the right area, you know. So it was quite interesting to see. I don't think we use communities enough, or we use them very, and I'm talking more from a public sector. I'm obviously no longer in the private sector, so I'm talking from a very particular stance. But I think often we don't use them enough as our tools for design of where things could be set up, where our interventions actually could happen, rather than just availability of land. Is that land the right place to do that? I think often we go, oh, we own that piece of land, therefore that's where this new hospital or clinic will happen, but is that actually in the right space? And so I think that's where the standards of the need, say for a hospital or clinic, need to actually overlap with the community in which that need has been identified in. Yeah, so that is something that's really I'm really passionate about, and sort of in the job that I'm in, and that's where I see it working out a little bit. Yeah. Sorry, I speak in tangents, so I hope that's sort of
no, it makes sense. I think those standards are also just sometimes so outdated and contextually inappropriate, and yeah, it's almost like a thesis by itself to update those. Larisse, you have a question?
Hi, yes, I really loved your presentation. I can see that it was done, like you said, labor of love, and like really rich in like unpacking a lot of layers that you can't just pick up on like a QGIS layer or just basic mapping. So what I was just interested in is the relationship of the schools, because you said there were quite a lot of schools in gang territory, how that works, if education at all had a positive impact, if any. Yeah, just interested in that.
Yeah, so what was quite interesting with a lot of the schools was the fortification of them. So most of the schools have actually, I mean, I should I see we're over time a little bit, but I would love to pull up the map, and I love chatting about this, but basically most of the schools, so the actual building footprint, they've pulled about 3 different layers of fencing around it, and half of the school's land actually is just not utilized, and there's one school that utilizes their playing field sort of space. Everything else has actually been pulled right up for protection. So schools have responded, and obviously for children's security in that way, and just fortifying and actually lopping off parts of their own land and letting it lie fallow, just because it's actually not safe enough for children to be out on that land. And so that's where a lot of the partnerships start coming in, because there are actually a lot of users in that space who are running programs, and how do you actually then build on that momentum to utilize half of the school property to add security or add whatever the needs are, be it new library or whatever. I mean, I'm not going to put ideas on it, but just sort of shared spaces, I think, is quite important. And yeah, but the schools currently, their response, I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking for currently how they respond, is to try and fortify, just because it isn't safe. And it's so dynamic. I think that's also the interesting thing. Part of my thesis had a mapping of, I think it was 4 or 5 months worth of gang activity, just a snapshot of each month where the major activity was. And it is so varied how it moves across the community. It's so hard to pinpoint. And I think that's why the design needs to be as flexible and nuanced to try and cater for that.
Yeah,
strategies
more proactive instead of reactive, because if you keep reacting, it changes and you're too late.
Exactly. Yeah, you're so delayed almost in your response. Yeah.
Super interesting, Phillippa. I wish we could talk more, but we will at the end. So I just want to give Nicola also a chance, and then we can make the floor open for more discussion. And I'm interested to hear how you guys have been using your work in your thesis in your actual work currently. So that's also an interesting topic I think we should cover. But thanks so much, Nicola.
Yes.
So you also started off with architecture, right? At UCT?
I did, yes.
And then went into urban design after that.
Yeah, after working for a few years, I went back to school to do urban design masters, which was actually quite hard, because once you've zoomed into very little things like how tiles join with a step, with a this, with a that, to like zooming out so much.
It's a different scale.
Yeah.
But when did you graduate? How long ago?
I finished the urban design course in 2015.
Okay.
I think from what I can see, I am the only one that studied under Henry Comrie.
Yes.
And I must say, even looking at the presentations, I have goosebumps. They were so amazing. But I feel like what Henry pushed us to do was a very different way of thinking. What he basically pushed us towards was saying that you're only studying this course once and go crazy with it. Like, things doesn't always have to make sense, and it's just an idea, and it's the biggest idea, and don't worry too much about the implementation and the sensitivity of it, like just play with it. So my presentation might seem a bit ludicrous compared to the others, but just to explain like where it came from, of him asking us to just like everything is possible thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting how that plays such a big role in the way that you approach it. But I'm interested to see how that played out in your case, and also how it has impacted on your working situation. So yeah, over to you.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes. It's in PowerPoint at the moment.
I just need to, sorry. Ooh, I just need to get rid of your guys' here. Okay. So the name of my dissertation was called Re-envisioning the Khayelitsha Center through Transport-Oriented Development, which is better known as TOD, which is a very broad term, but it came from more of like first world countries where transport, public transport is quite advanced as opposed to South African context. So my strategy on this dissertation was to see how can we apply something like TOD in a context where public transport is actually not as efficient yet. So the site or Khayelitsha that I chose as a case study is from a transport perspective, it's linked to Spine Road, which links to the N2. So that's the main link to the greater Cape Town Metropole. And on the rail line, it is on the Metro Southeast line, which is obviously, if you look at it on this map, Khayelitsha is extremely marginalized, although it's quite a vibrant hub. The idea was to how do we connect this very marginalized vibrancy to the rest of Cape Town. So from looking at the usage of transport in the area, I found that mostly people were either walking or taking rail to places of work and school. Obviously, the public transport usage for other modes are also quite high, with private vehicle access being quite low. So for the dissertation, for the design part of the dissertation, I zoomed into the 500-meter circle around the rail station. So that is also known as a walkable circle. But mostly I've zoomed into the piece of vacant land that is the dotted arrow, that it's a strip of vacant land that leads towards the rail station, goes through the rail station and then through a retail mall, which is a public right-of-way that mall has, it's been part of the design so that it can link to the rail station. So the City of Cape Town has also done some work in the area in order to kickstart this vibrant hub, establishing a vibrant hub for Khayelitsha. So they've implemented a few anchor projects, which the hope was for private development to latch onto these projects and for the area to grow based on these catalysts that they've built. So towards the back, there's the cricket oval and athletics track. And then we have a multi-purpose sports center, which is quite a new and modern building. Then the retail mall with the right of access, or the public right of way, which I've discussed in the slide before. And then obviously quite a modern rail station. So these were their four anchor projects. And then from a landscape perspective, they've done a civic square at the end of the mall, which got dilapidated over time, and then also a remembrance square, which is located in front of the Khayelitsha District Hospital. So all of these projects have been on the ground, but then completely disconnected from each other. So just to give you a sense of scale of the site that I worked in. So behind the mall, there's about 19 city blocks, Cape Town city blocks. And then that whole area behind the mall is as big as the Cape Town rail station with the public square in front of it. So the scale is actually quite big, and I must say that was challenging. in terms of working in a sensitive way. So as I mentioned before, I looked at some urban design theories and strategies, and I applied them to a South African context. So the first strategy I investigated was integrating land use and transport planning. It's basically the principle that land use planning or zoning should happen in conjunction with transport planning in order to benefit from private investors or investment. There's a very broad term for it called value capturing, which we won't go into. And then another idea under the strategy is that site-owned or state-owned land should be zoned accordingly to best suit the TOD strategies or developments or proposals in order to pre-package those land parcels for investment and development once the TOD development starts latching onto the interventions. So those are the public transport hubs or existing hubs, and that's the rail station and the taxi rank. And then I looked at the main arterials picking people up where they go on a rail, where they go onto a road transport to Spine Road, which leads to the N2. So these are the main connectors connecting the people from Khayelitsha to Cape Town and vice versa. Then I looked at land ownership to see how we can pre-package some of these parcels, and then to see what needs to happen in terms of zoning to pre-package and benefit from state-owned land in these areas. The second strategy was that in order for TOD to work in a global context and also in a South African context, you need the right amount of densities of people around these transport interchanges. And obviously for density, you need high-rise buildings, which in this context, I mean, it's very flat. Even the retail mall, I think, is about it's just one story. So how to prepare for these densities. And then I looked at the amount of, let's say, building footprint or floor space to house these densities. What are the numbers required for TOD interventions to start working? Third strategy was prioritizing pedestrian-oriented space. Obviously, once you start densifying and buildings are going up, you need to still acknowledge the fact that people are mostly walking in the area, and it needs to be, the densities should remain contextual and sensitive to the person on the ground, especially if you want it to make a good experience to access public transport interchanges. So here you can see the main pedestrian link that I focused on, as well as the desire lines where inhabitants of the area are mostly walking. So I'm going to take you through a walkthrough of how the experience of walking in the area feels like. So 1 and 2 is just extremely, one is extremely empty, and then as you near the station, the commercial aspect starts increasing significantly. And then as you walk up the ramp, there's quite a bit of activity happening there in terms of markets and people selling goods. And then this is when you walk through the rail station, number 5, leads us to the retail mall, which is also quite vibrant with stalls on the inside of the pedestrian right of way, and then shops on the sides. And then as you reach the end of the mall, everything falls flat. And there's not much happening there, although a lot of people walk across this vacant piece of land. And the fourth strategy was that in order to make the Khayelitsha train station area more, to attract more people and more activity, you need a diverse range of things happening in the area, and also more means of access. So the more options there is to get to the Khayelitsha center in terms of transport, and the more things that are happening there, the more people will go there. So at the moment, it's mostly markets, and there's a big focus on sport as well. And that is looking at the types of uses required in order for this TOD proposal to work according to the numbers. So after I've narrowed down the 4 strategies, I try to implement them to the site. So this is my walkway where I've highlighted the active edges on the buildings, also on the anchor projects from the city. And here I've implemented strategy number 1, looking at the main arterials where public transport stops can happen, aligning the zoning with them, and also towards the back of the vacant site to see how best you can arrange for access to make sure that the transport routes work. And then looking at different types of transport interchanges, how formal are they, how far apart are they, which one has markets and which one are just smaller pickup points. And this is implementing strategy number 2 with the density the densities required. So that's adding the bulk to the area that we need. So yeah, you can see there's a big jump between now high-rise buildings with the very smaller residential buildings to the side. So then the idea is that smaller or lower development and buildings should latch onto these higher rise buildings, and to just distribute the scale a bit and to drop the scale down towards the residential area. So to mitigate how these high-rise buildings would sit in the landscape. And then strategy 3, prioritizing pedestrians within this new high-rise area. So just to, in section C, if we put up or use the high-rise idea, how it will feel and look to the person on the ground, and exploring that in all the areas throughout this walkway. And the 4th strategy, where it's attracting a diverse group of people and a diverse range of activities, how we can establish that. And with the sports center at the back, you would add student housing, more schools, libraries. Like, how would this hub feed each other, and how would you be more attractive to the wider Cape Town metropole? And to see how this sits within our public transport interchanges, and how the general look and feel of the area would look after these 4 strategies have been implemented. So that's a more detailed drawing of the end vision. So you can see we've bulked up the mall quite a bit, done the markets on both sides of the railway station on the high-rise roofs, and then the whole area down the pedestrian strip, developed that in the work units above little retail shops to get our densities. So that is I would say, the end vision that I proposed. And then just to do a new walkthrough, this is the plan of the same area, and then just how the pedestrian experience would be walking from the one end to the other end. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Nicola. That was such a nice presentation. I really enjoy your systematic way of explaining it. And I think it's so clear, and I think it's very useful for other students maybe to see how you can structure that kind of discussion. And yeah, I think Licha CBD is such a, yeah, it's such a difficult site. So many people have had so many visions for it. And I know there's been so many documents written for the proposed ideas for the site. And yeah, I think you were quite brave to choose that site, but it's actually not as extreme as I thought it would be. It's actually very realistic. I think it has a lot of potential to actually take place. I don't know if anyone has a specific question, because I was definitely wondering about your testing of the ideas in reality and how zoning and things like that have obviously played a role. But maybe Kevin, if you want to go first.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. I actually have gone through your thesis before when I was studying, and I found it so fascinating at how you contextualized TOD in Kailicha, because it was almost futuristic, but also very contextual. So yeah, just that's a comment I wanted to put out there. I found it very, very inspiring to see how you can dream about how TOD can look like in that kind of context. But I also wanted to ask about density. I know you've talked about it. I know TOD is very infamous for increasing in density. And I know that area in the Metro Southeast, I think is characterized by a lot of like low density residential dwellings. So yeah, what was your reflection on increasing density? How would that look like at closer to the corridor?
Yeah, so my thinking on that is that it is it's a difficult one, because we haven't really seen the right amount of densities in those areas, so we actually don't know what they will look like. But if I can use my imagination once again, I would, I don't know if you've been there and seen the live work units that has been done, I think by VPUU, not sure.
Yeah.
So I would,
yes, I've seen it, yeah.
Something like that, but on a bigger scale. We maybe have 2-story retail, and then 3 stories up, little walk-up units. And that gives you 5 stories. I would imagine that is the best way to look at it, to always keep the ground floor, or if not the 2 first floors, activated.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Jody, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting. I'm finding it fascinating because I've been involved in so many debates lately where people are almost juxtaposing township economic development or township development and TOD, and almost saying that the two are in tension with each other, and we have to sort of make a policy choice around, are we doing one or the other? And so you presenting TOD in a township context, so that's very interesting for me. That site is notoriously underdeveloped because of institutional issues. Did you look at that at all in terms of how that could actually be unblocked or implemented?
I did, but like I said at the time, Henry was very much encouraging us to not get stuck, which was deflating in a way, but also I understood like we're gonna sit at the end of a year and not have much to show for it in that way. But at the time, I know now there's quite a big building behind the mall now for I think it's a non-profit organization that has quite a big building there. And then on the site before the rail station, there's a block of apartments now, which is quite encouraging. So it did give me some hope that things will start happening eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Kalicha Development Fund, or I'm not exactly sure what the name is, but it was almost created as a vehicle to make things happen faster, but in a way it made things happen slower because it's
Much
this
slower, yeah.
institutional tension between the city and between them. But yeah, obviously you couldn't really, I guess, go into too much.
I did want to put in a slide showing those two ones that happened. Those two buildings I referred to, but it still looks like, yeah, there's so much more, there's still so much space that I actually thought maybe I'm just gonna shoot myself in the foot there.
Yeah, I think it's always nice to go back to your work, and I can see that all three of you guys are really passionate about it, and I almost want to just combine all your theses into one and, like, you know, use the methodology and the idea of the migrants and the TOD and that kind of context, and come up with something new from that. But I think what would be interesting is maybe to open the floor to discuss things around maybe what your thesis helped you with in terms of looking for work, and did it help you in terms of building a network, and what are the kind of things that you learned from your thesis and that whole process, or even just the course in general, studying urban design, and upon reflection, what do you think you would have done differently? Yeah, that's quite a lot of questions in one, but does someone have a specific question around this topic, or should we just go around with the speakers? Carl, do you not have a question? You usually are quite inquisitive.
I don't have any questions, but it's been a very interesting, very informative, and learned quite a lot tonight.
Cool, I'm glad. Okay, so maybe if I ask Kevin if there's something specific that from the course that you are now really using in your work that you're doing, or are you not using it? Is there something that you think you could have done differently to make it more useful for you in practice as an urban designer?
That's a very interesting question, Janine. I think I'm definitely using a lot of the things that I learned, but I'm unpacking them slowly as I explore different aspects of my work. So, you know, even representation is so important, because I'm currently working on a project that looks at demarcation and how people demarcate pieces of land for security of tenure. I would never think representation would help me in that way, trying to understand how people actually demarcate their own spaces and what practical tools they can use, and that's something we did when we were doing the representation course. And then I think doing the thesis on migrants, I think, allowed me to start seeing how to interpret cities from different perspectives, because I always saw the city from my own perspective. But it's interesting to start seeing how other people also experience the city. And in the work that I had been doing post my thesis, because I worked with a lot of CBOs, like Cork and BPUU, and it was so fascinating to also see how people build space from a different perspective, and not coming in as the designer who knows how to plan cities, but also listening to how other people who have different lived realities want to build their own cities. So I think what the urban design program allowed me to do, at least, was to take a step back and be more reflective than be more enforcing. And I happen to think if I came with Katie always calls it the capital U, capital D of urban design, I probably would have been more the enforcer. But now I think the course was really beneficial for me to be more reflective about listening. And I think Phillippa's thesis, I think, also helped me understand that you can always be a designer, but there's so much benefit that comes to listening to people's lived realities and allowing a more collaborative process.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was going to ask Phillippa as well. Phillippa, is there anything that you can maybe reflect on in terms of this idea of your role as a designer, and is it maybe frustrating for you in your work, the fact that you have to almost, that you're not always able to really live out this kind of passion of yours, to not always just be the designer? Or do you think that you are actually able to use that kind of perspective that you gain through your thesis in your current work? And yeah, you can talk about the city. I mean, it doesn't have to it doesn't have to go beyond here, or no one will blame you for what you say.
No, not at all. No, I think yeah, big institutions have their merits and also
It's
obviously
generic,
their failings.
yeah.
I mean, it's exactly. No, I think what I found, I had two very different sort of personalities almost from when I went into the course and when I came out of it, because I was still in the same position within the city.
Yeah.
But I think the urban theory that Katie taught really shifted my perspective. I mean, I've been inclined, public sector has always been what I've been interested in, but how it actually can land for the public has been where I've had a lot of question marks. And the theory that yeah, Katie lectured on and the readings was just so yeah, mind-blowing for me, on going, oh, there are different ways to test things. You don't actually have to do, you don't have to do a standard stage 1 to 6, you know, inception to close out, you know, that actually it doesn't have to look like that. There's actually movement in between that can happen. I think a big learning from thesis versus reality, or day-to-day rather than reality, let me not say reality, day-to-day, I think is the time. I think it is time consuming, especially when you have construction cost associated with your projects. And I think that's where I'm trying to work, how does institutions, I'm not going to name institutions. Institutions usually work with an MTREF budget that identifies 3 years in a 10-year budget cycle. And often those do not take into account the planning process for that budget. It almost lands immediately at sort of the inception, site's already been identified, no actual engagement prior to the choice of. And I think that's where it's been quite interesting, being able to maybe push back a little bit. There have been some, and I've now got the language in which to push back in a little bit. So it's been good. I mean, it's a lot more robust discussions. And what we are looking at is doing an internal, hopefully it'll get approved, participation process review of our department alone. I mean, at the moment, we can't change how our directorate and the city in its whole sort of operates with its, I think it's got its PPU unit that runs a lot of the public participation stuff. But as a department ourselves, I've been driving some of the rewriting of our internal, at least how we do engagement. So it is slowly filtering into our jobs, just because you can see with projects not lasting long, you know, being vandalized quickly, you know, investments being wasted. Actually, you can't flog a dead horse. Something's not working and we need to change it. So yeah,
that's really encouraging, actually.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you can drive something like that. It must be quite, yeah, it must be quite rewarding in a way. And I hope it will be more rewarding just beyond your redesign of the process.
Oh, thanks. I hope so too. She says weeping.
Yeah, I can hear. So I guess, Nicola, just in terms of how you've actually experienced going from studying to working and studying and working again, and what you were saying at the beginning about shifting between the scales, is there anything that you've been reflecting on since you've now started working that could maybe be useful for future urban designers, current urban designers?
I would say for current architects, I would definitely encourage to do the urban design course. It's completely shifted my thinking of building not for the client or the clients, but for the public that is going to walk past these buildings. And it's hard once you've engaged in that urban design world to ever not think about it, which is great. And I do think the architecture's course should maybe engage a bit more with the urban design classes in some way. Yeah, I would definitely, if someone is thinking of adding the course or shifting towards urban design, I would definitely encourage that. And yeah, I mean, there's also, I worked at the city for about 3 years after I graduated, and I must say, even working for private sector versus public sector, the difference is quite significant. But I think in all of them, you are designing for the public, for the people, which is, I think, such a great way of thinking about it after moving away from more of the architecture side of it. So it doesn't matter if it's a big private development or if it's a public facility, like it's always keeping the public realm and the outside environment in mind, which I think is yeah, very valuable lesson I've learned.
That's really inspiring words, Nicola, because I think it's really true. And I think a lot of times people forget the simplicity of the purpose, actually. Well, obviously it's complex, but yeah, if you simplify it into that you've said it quite well. So do we have any questions from the floor or any comments?
Hello. Hi, guys. I have a quick comment. Hey, thanks so much for that. That was super inspiring. And Nicola, I have to say, I absolutely agree with you that I think architecture kind of, you become too specific to the interior, like, you know, to what that building needs, that you forget to understand sort of what it's, how it engages with its context and what needs to happen around the space and stuff like that. But I think what's been really interesting from this talk and what I'm taking away from it is kind of this like differentiation between a designer coming into a project, getting a brief, and then kind of taking your ideas of the world and what you think, and then conceptually kind of seeing that out versus the sort of facilitator role that you're playing. So I think, Phillippa, your project kind of spoke to that point on. And I think it would be really interesting. I think probably maybe what we need to do more as designers is to actually just facilitate that process of how do you develop the brief, what is the brief, and then what is the best way to make the brief happen, but also to enable the community and the people that are living in the environment to see that through. So I think that's super fascinating. And I think that's also very exciting. It's kind of takes the pressure and stress off you as like the individual designer with a team of consultants to make things happen.
Yeah, and I think that's relevant for public and private kind of work, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be so nice to see more private projects kind of following this trajectory and working with developers, but in this manner where it's a lot more inclusive and there's a lot more kind of on the ground communication than high level thinking and stuff.
No, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good reflection. Thanks, Sumia. Do we have any other reflections or final comments? Kevin.
Yeah, just reflecting on what Nicola also said, I also really struggled in the course. I think in terms of, because I was wearing so many hats, because I had a background in landscape architecture, planning, and I'm doing urban design. So I wasn't able to know where one ends and where one begins. So even now in practice, I think it's constantly trying to understand how the three merge, because I'm trying to see a more transdisciplinary approach where they all can work together and they all inform each other. Because I think the way it had been structured, where you think in one way and that's your silo, that's your focus, I think hasn't been very helpful. So I just wanted to also get a sense from everyone in the room, like if there's those tensions and people who are working and studying, do you feel tensions between switching the roles, or are you taking like a more integrated approach, trying to sit in the different hats at the same time?
I think that's a difficult question, actually. For myself, I always try and figure out how I can fit into a different hat and expand my own hats. But I definitely think that trying to be more interdisciplinary is actually the most valuable way of going around instead of moving between hats, but that's not always possible. But I think what Nicola said is interesting in terms of, yeah, the more you engage with different fields and different options of doing it, the more it becomes embedded in the way that you think. And they're not really a matter of switching hats. It's just the automatic intuition of how you work. At least that's how I see it. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that. Okay. Kevin, you gave us something to think about. I think everyone is tired and maybe ready for dinner, but yeah, maybe a really good way to end. Thanks so much, everyone. I think tonight has been super, super inspiring. And yeah, as Katie says, like really responsive and socially responsive topics to discuss. And I feel like, firstly, you know, just not being in South Africa, always listening to these topics makes me miss home. And it's really just inspiring to see how amazing the work is that's coming from you guys. And yeah, I hope that we can take the conversation further and keep networking with each other. If you guys have questions after this event and you want me to put you in touch with someone, that can also happen. I think that's the whole purpose of the Young Urbanists. And if you have your own idea for what you want to present, or there's students in this event right now who would like to present their work later, I think that's also a great idea. I think we should continue these kinds of conversations and learn from studying and practice and keep bouncing our ideas between each other. But yeah, thanks so much, Kevin, Nicola, Phillippa. You guys have been really inspiring, and thanks for taking the time to present it and go back into the deep memories of your thesis and yeah, just inspire everyone with all your hard work. So yeah, with that, I will end tonight's session, and yeah, I hope everyone has a nice evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Janine.
So much, Janine.
Thanks, Janine.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Janine.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.